Right, so in regards to function, the key thing to start off with and to think about is the types of tendons there are. And broadly, we have defined really nicely by Birch two types of tendons. So positional tendons that are going to function to transfer load, and energy storage tendons that are going to store energy within function, and that's going to have implications for performance, as we'll see, as well as for efficiency of our human movement. And we know that these tendons have greater water content. We know that they also are able to strain, or actually, I shouldn't say they're able to strain more. They tend to have display greater strain within functional movements. So, for example, if we compare Achilles during hopping, there's an 8% strain on average, whereas if we compare the tibialis anterior, 3.1% strain. So there is a difference in absorption of energy clearly through this mechanism of strain. And if we look at this in more detail, really what it comes down to is stretch-shorten cycle. And the stretch-shorten cycle happens when we're doing walking, running, jumping, upper limb. It happens in throwing. It is a functional mechanism within the tendon, and it is the way the tendon absorbs energy. It only happens when movements are relatively fast, so energy has less potential to store energy. Tendon has less potential to store energy with slow movements. So let's have a look at the SSC. So stretch, shorten, cycle. We have someone say in this function, because they're landing on their toes, it's going to be sprinting or jumping, and they're going to have pre-activation of their calf muscle. They're going to land, then they're going to have a stretch of their muscle tendon unit. Okay, so that can be misleading because often you don't really have much lengthening of the muscle itself, mainly the tendon, but we'll come back to that. And then you have a shortening phase where the muscle and the tendon tends to shorten, and some of that energy that was stored in the tendon is then harnessed and released. So this is our stretch shortening cycle, and a very, very important function of tendon. So when we're talking about tendon storing energy, it tends to happen within the stretch shortening cycle rather than, within you do a slow biceps curl or you do a slow calf raise. It's not going to store nearly as much energy during those functions. So stretch shortening cycle is good. There is greater efficiency, and that's mainly because as I've sort of already alluded to, the muscle in a lot of times when it's optimized in terms of the efficiency of human movement, the muscle can be isometric. So Hoff back in '83 did some experiments showing that if you're looking at people walking, their calf muscle can be close to isometric, and that allows obviously a really good optimal length tension. You can work in the middle of your muscle length tension. Well, that will depend on some factors that we'll talk about in a second. You can also optimize your force velocity. You can make sure that your muscle doesn't contract too fast to reduce force potential by having a tendon that is contributing to the movement. So you optimize some of these characteristics. You also have the energy storing passive energy, the tendon storing passive energy, and as well as a series elastic component within the muscle. So you have passive energy that can be then used to harness to increase the efficiency. So that's the reason why we can walk for hours and hours and hours and hours, because walking is primarily an activity where the tendon is able to store and release energy to reduce fatigue of the muscle, particularly in the calf. Now, there's also implications for performance. So tendons can recoil much faster than a muscle could ever imagine to. So when you're going through that second phase, the shortening, the tendon recoil really is the first thing that drives that. And there's also potentiation and increased activation of the muscle. So there's increased EMG with the stretch shorten cycle. Okay. Now, if we look at one thing that I'm really interested in is the loading profile of the stretch shortened cycle and what it actually means, i.e. how is it different? And people talk about, oh yes, it's higher force. And yes, it is, but it's interesting in that if you look at stretch shortening cycle in the Achilles, this is just an example that I've picked, you can have 2 to 3 times body weight with walking, you can have 6 to 8 times body weight um, load going through it with running. You can have 11 times body weight with hopping and a strain of around 8% with hopping, which is quite high. But it's pretty similar when you look at a maximum isometric. So if you do a maximum isometric in a dynamometer plantarflexion, you can get up to 10 times body weight load going through your Achilles tendon and 8% strain. So there's not much difference there. But I accept that if you're doing a maximal hop, that's going to be different to a small hop. So that's something to bear in mind. So potentially load for some of the maximal SSC activity is going to be higher. The thing that is definitely higher is a strain rate. So strain rate within the tendon for SSC activities is really high. So you can get up to, say, for example, 70% strain per second in running, depending on the intensity. And it's going to really not be much higher than about 10% per second for doing some of your slow loading type activities. And this example is an isometric. Building up to maximal over 1 second. It's going to be up to 10 seconds strain per second. So I think this probably is related to injury, the Achilles tendon strain rate or tendon strain rate in general in terms of SSC. The other thing that is unique to SSC is that during SSC the tendon absorbs energy and some of that energy is lost. So it is lost, and that is what we call hysteresis, so a loss of energy. So if you look at the loading rate when you are loading, it is somewhere like that, and then it drops off, it becomes much less steep. So some of that energy is lost when you're unloading that tendon. So that energy is obviously absorbed by the tendon. So absorbing energy may be a good thing in some situations because you have actually, before I talk about that, the energy loss really is due to the viscoelasticity in the tendon. So you've got the ground substance which makes it more of a viscous or viscoelastic material rather than just being an elastic spring. And the ground substance will therefore bring about some of this energy loss. It may be a good thing for some tendons. So for example, it may be a good shock absorbing mechanism. So people landing, doing landing, sudden stopping and landing type tasks, it's actually a time when the tendon absorbs a lot of energy, and having good energy absorbing mechanisms, it's almost like a dampening mechanism. The tendon dampens and absorbs load and saves other tissues. But certainly this is related to risk of injury. There's no doubt about that. But if you're looking at efficiency, then you want less hysteresis. You don't want any hysteresis. So if you're a marathon runner and you're running along for 2 hours, you want to be having as elastic type tendons as possible to allow you to save your muscles and to minimize hysteresis and potential damage. We know that we can load people. So if we give people loading programs over a number of weeks, their hysteresis will go down. So for example, plyometrics in older groups has been shown, and strength training plyometrics in adults and strength training in older. But that's the tip of the iceberg. There are lots of examples of hysteresis decreasing, so less energy loss with loading. So let's now look at the requirements for SSC function. And this is a really clinically important thing because we need to clinically be able to know how can we restore someone's stretch shortening cycle function. And we'll talk about losses in stretch shortening cycle function in pathology. So there are passive components to the SSC clearly. So things like the stiffness in the tendon. So basically, you've got a tendon that needs to be absorbing energy well and releasing energy well to be able to, give you a good efficiency and performance in your SSC. And as you also need a good active component, and this is neuro as well as muscular. So you have force generating capacity based on those two elements. So the structure, how big your muscle is, the architecture, so the pronation angle, the length of the fascicles, all these things will determine the speed and the torque that you can produce within that muscle, as well as the neural aspects, and so reflex potentiation, activation of the muscle, and the rate of force development. So these are really important things in terms of SSC. And actually, going back to that, when I'm looking at someone clinically, these are the things when I'm restoring their function after you've dealt with pain, you want to be looking at in terms of trying to bring about a good outcome for someone going back to SSC function. Now, let's dissect stiffness a little bit, because stiffness tends to be one of these things that is just very confusing and tends to get people sort of very worked up. I know it certainly did for me for a good sort of 5 years. But so stiffness is, all it is the rate of elongation, so deformation in the tendon at a certain load. So it's this gradient, it's the rate of change in length for a given force, and it gives you, it basically tells you about its resistance to stretch. The easiest way to define it is resistance to stretch. And it is a structural property, and that is that it takes into account the dimensions of the tendon, as opposed to modulus. And you probably, if you're reading papers on stiffness and biomechanics of tendons and other tissues, you'll be familiar with these terms. Modulus is, or elastic modulus is, exactly the same as stiffness, but it's taken away the measurement, so millimeters elongation. Sorry, the units is what I'm trying to say. So there's no units, so it's a unitless measure. So therefore you can compare different tendons of different size and it makes sense. Okay, that's all the modulus is. So it's stress strain. So you're looking at stress, which is force divided by cross-sectional area, and strain, which is elongation divided by the actual length of the tendon. So if you're confused about modulus and stiffness, I hope that has cleared it up. Because it is an area that you will come across if you're reading some of these papers. So in terms of optimal tendon stiffness, what is optimal tendon stiffness? Now that's $1 million question, and it really does depend on your function, on your person, on your tendon. So if we look at just some generalities though, a compliant tendon will absorb load better, so it may be more efficient. But a stiff tendon will have a greater maximal energy storing potential. But it will only be able to store energy under high load because it is stiffer. If you've got muscle length tension, looking at muscle length tension, if you've got a really stiff tendon, it's going to force the muscle to stretch more. So you're going to be working in a too long range. So you may be working on the sort of descending leg of your length tension curve. If you've got, if you're looking at muscle risk, that will increase your risk of injury because your muscle clearly is going to be stretching more in eccentric load absorbing activities. If you're looking at rate of force development, clearly a stiffer tendon is better because it will transfer that load to the skeletal system to allow you to move much faster. And if you're looking at jump performance, clearly again a stiffer tendon is better because that relates to rate of force development. So in general terms, stiffness may be better for power, compliance for efficiency. So it is really a horses for courses type thing. One advice I can give you, and we'll go through this in the rehab section as much as we can, don't meddle with athletes and other people's stiffness too much. It's often either self-selected or related to the years of training they've done, because it can be a way of bringing about injuries. Okay, so performance is also related to a lot of these factors we've been talking about. So if you're looking at people jumping and running type performance, stiffness of the tendon will generally give you better performance. Leg stiffness, so this is now looking at the amount of joint excursion. So we know that sprinters have much greater leg stiffness, and people that jump higher tend to have greater leg stiffness. And this is a neuromuscular thing. It's not a stiffens in our muscles are tight. Neuromuscular stiffness in terms of less joint movement during a particular movement function. Muscle strength is obviously going to be a predictor of performance, as well as rate of force development and a lot of other factors. But again, if we're looking at performance, we're looking at improving performance, these are the things we tend to look at. Lovely. So, covered a fair bit there. Let's move straight on to metabolism and response to load. So let's move on to function.